Ladies and gentlemen, if you have ever thought history was boring, if you've ever sat in class with your head on the desk thinking, why do I need to know about powdered wigs, spinning wheels, and some people with muskets marching in lines? Then tonight, I have the perfect bedtime story for you. A story so simple, so full of details about the ordinary lives of people in colonial America, that it just might put you to sleep faster than counting sheep. Because when we think about history, we often imagine big wars, founding fathers writing declarations, or witches being accused in Salem. But the truth is, most of colonial America wasn't about dramatic speeches or shocking trials. It was about survival, about working from sunrise to sunset, about eating what you grew, and about living lives that to us today might feel dull, difficult, and repetitive. So let me take you there, to the world of the 17th and 18th centuries, to smell the smoky air of a one-room house, to hear the clatter of wooden shoes on dirt floors, and to see just how people actually lived in colonial America. Imagine you're waking up in Massachusetts in the year 1700. There's no alarm clock on your phone because there are no phones, there's no bed with a mattress because most people slept on straw, and there's certainly no hot shower to start your day. Instead, the rooster outside is your alarm, the chilly draft blowing through the cracks in your cabin is your shower, and your blanket is probably a coarse wool cover made by hand. Most houses were small, usually 1 or 2 rooms, built from wood, with tiny windows that let in very little light. If you were lucky, your family had glass in those windows. If not, you had oiled paper or shutters that could barely keep out the cold. Privacy. Forget it. Entire families slept in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed, and in larger families, children often shared spaces with siblings packed together like spoons in a drawer. Breakfast was not pancakes dripping with syrup or bacon sizzling in a pan. It was more likely porridge, cornmeal mush, or bread that had been baked days earlier. Butter was a treat that had to be churned by hand, milk was warm straight from the cow, and sugar was so expensive that many families rarely tasted it. Most people sweetened their food with molasses if they could afford even that. After breakfast, the workday began, and when I say work, I mean work from sunrise to sunset. Children weren't off playing video games or hanging around at school for only a few hours. Boys were out chopping wood, herding animals, or planting crops, while girls were spinning thread, cooking, fetching water, and making candles. Everyone contributed, because survival depended on it. Colonial America was an agricultural society. Whether you lived in New England, the Middle Colonies, or the Southern plantations, food had to come from the land, and the land demanded hard labor. Farmers grew corn, wheat, tobacco, and rice depending on where they lived. In Virginia and the Carolinas, tobacco and rice were cash crops, grown not just for family use but for trade, often with the help of enslaved Africans who were forced into brutal, endless labor. In New England, where the soil was rocky and the winters long, families grew just enough to survive: corn, beans, squash, and maybe some livestock like pigs or chickens. Hunting and fishing added to the diet, though it was never glamorous. A family might salt pork in barrels to last through the winter, or dry fish on racks in the sun, hoping it wouldn't spoil. Imagine eating salted codfish or cornmeal mush nearly every day. That was normal. Now, let's talk about clothes. Forget jeans, sneakers, or anything comfortable. In colonial America, clothes were homemade or very expensive if purchased from Europe. Women wore long gowns or dresses made of wool or linen, often layered with aprons and caps. Men wore breeches, stockings, shirts, and waistcoats, with heavy coats in the winter. And children, well, small boys wore dresses until they were old enough to be considered little men, at which point they switched to breeches. Laundry day wasn't just tossing clothes in a machine with a pod. It was a grueling process of heating water over a fire, scrubbing clothes by hand, and hanging them to dry. Soap, when available, was made from lye and animal fat. And yes, it smelled as bad as you think. What about school? Education was highly valued in some colonies, especially in New England, but not everyone had access. Wealthy families hired tutors or sent their sons to grammar schools. Poorer children often learned just enough to read the Bible and sign their names. Girls were less likely to receive formal schooling, as their education was considered to be in the skills of the home: cooking, sewing, and child rearing. Lessons, when they happened, were harsh. Teachers used the dreaded dunce cap, or corporal punishment for mistakes, and textbooks were few. The famous New England primer taught children their ABCs alongside religious verses, making education as much about saving souls as teaching letters. Religion was everywhere in colonial life. In Puritan New England, Sunday meant hours-long church services where everyone attended, no matter how tired they were from the week's labor. The Sabbath was strictly observed. No games, no dancing, no unnecessary work. In the Middle Colonies, you might find a mix of faiths: Quakers, Catholics, Jews, and Protestants all trying to practice freely. In the Southern Colonies, Anglicanism dominated, but church attendance often varied depending on how close families lived to a meeting house. Religion provided not just spiritual guidance but also social order and community rules. Morality was public business, and neighbors kept close watch on one another's behavior. But it wasn't all drudgery. People did find ways to entertain themselves. After a long day of work, families might gather around the hearth to tell stories, sing songs, or play simple games. Children played with dolls made of corn husks or wooden toys, and adults enjoyed card games, checkers, or community dances. In towns, fairs and markets provided social gatherings where people traded goods and news. The tavern was an important meeting place too, especially for men, who would gather to drink ale, discuss politics, or listen to travelers share stories from distant places. Yet danger was never far away. Disease was a constant threat. Smallpox, dysentery, malaria, and yellow fever claimed countless lives, especially among children. Medicine was primitive, relying on herbs, bleeding, or other methods we would now consider harmful. Doctors were scarce, and most illnesses were treated at home with remedies passed down through generations. Death was a familiar part of life, and cemeteries filled quickly. Travel, too, was slow and risky. Roads were rough, often nothing more than dirt paths that turned to mud in the rain. Most people walked, rode horses, or used wagons. Long journeys between colonies could take days or weeks, and the idea of traveling from Boston to Philadelphia, which today might take a few hours by car, was a serious expedition. Letters traveled slowly, often carried by riders or ships, and news could take months to arrive from Europe. One cannot talk about colonial America without mentioning slavery and indentured servitude, both of which shaped everyday life for many. Enslaved Africans were forced into labor on southern plantations, their lives controlled, their freedom stolen, their families torn apart. Indentured servants, many of them poor Europeans, worked under contract for years in exchange for passage to the colonies. Their work was backbreaking, their treatment harsh, and their futures uncertain. For the wealthy landowners, however, this labor provided the foundation of prosperity. For the poor, it was a reminder that survival was often bought at the cost of freedom. Even politics, which we imagine as fiery debates and revolutionary sparks, was often slow and tedious. Local governments were run by assemblies of men who owned property, and decisions were made about taxes, land disputes, and community rules. Ordinary people had little voice, especially women, who were excluded from political life entirely. For most colonists, the idea of independence from Britain wasn't yet even a dream. It was simply about living day to day, paying dues, and obeying the Crown's laws. So, what does all this mean for us today? It means that while we think of colonial America as the birthplace of a nation, it was also just the ordinary, exhausting reality of human lives. People woke up, worked hard, ate simple food, endured illness, and found small joys where they could. Their lives were not glamorous, but they were real. And while history books may celebrate battles and declarations, the truth is that the fabric of colonial America was woven by everyday men, women, and children who struggled, endured, and survived. And if, by now, your eyelids are getting heavy, maybe that's because you've discovered what I promised at the start: history can indeed be the perfect lullaby. Colonial America, with its endless chores, its repetitive meals, its wooden shoes, and smoky cabins, reminds us that life back then was as much about boredom as it was about bravery. So the next time you hear about powdered wigs or muskets, just remember that behind all the drama, most people were simply trying to get through the day, one bowl of cornmeal mush at a time.